We all know that the Aboriginal horse came from this continent. Uh, we know that it got to Europe while the Bering Strait was a land bridge, and that's how Europe got the horse. Well, the bison came from Europe and crossed the land bridge and got to America. That's how we got the bison. So they're not really a native species. But they assume the horse died out after the last ice age because there was really not enough artifacts. A few other things, because when the Spaniards came to this country, and you got to remember, the Spaniards started coming out of New Mexico after they're down by the Aztecs and then up into the southwestern region of the country, and so they had some missionaries, priests, and some conquistador soldiers, and when the Pueblo revolt happened in 1680, 1690, and that's when the Pueblo Indians killed and drove out all the Spanish, the priests, everything. Roughly 1,500 horses got away. And so they assume them 1,500 horses came up all the way up to the northern plains and different areas of this country, where the native people that were up here, when the cavalry and white people encountered them, they were far more superior warriors on horseback than their European counterpart. So, I mean, if 1,500 horses got away, let's say maybe 70% were mares. They don't have any figures on that. The other 30% were studs, some mares too young to breed, young studs. So that leaves, just 800 or 900 horses, mares, at a 50% rate of repopulation, which is going to be pretty high for them time frames. They say after 1690, the Nez Perce up in the Palouse Valley, they were known for the Appaloosa horses, the spotted, fine maned, fine tailed. They were known for that horse. And supposedly it comes from the Spanish. Well, it's like, what did all the spotted Appaloosas do? Get together after the revolt and go up to, we're going to go to the Palouse Valley? Your Northern Plains natives, they were always known to have a little larger, square-built, round-boned, somewhat mulish in the hocks, and generally roan in color. So, so we know, they cannot scientifically prove that the horse died out in this continent. It's just an assumption that the Spaniards didn't see horses, but and the natives weren't supposed to get them till after the 1689 revolt. Well, in Spanish records, when the Spanish were expanding out of what is now northwest Texas, and this, if I remember quite right, was 1634. In their records, they were stopped with their northward expansion, and that's in 1634. And the only reason they were stopped because they were confronted by warriors on horseback who conducted warfare entirely different on horseback than the European counterpart. And that's way before the Pueblo revolt. The northern plains here were the last areas settled by the white man. Your people, the tribes that lived up here, they were great horse people, great horse people. They didn't have corrals and fences to keep them in. The horses stayed close to them. When you talk to the elders, and they'll tell you, we've always had the horse. We got horse songs that are from the creation way back, and so it, to me it makes sense that the horse never died out. There's no way them 1,500 horses could have populated this area and have different species in that very short time frame, about 100 years or less. So we know when Sitting Bull, everybody assumes that he surrendered up at Fort Beaufort, which was northwest Dakota territory at the time. He was tricked into coming to, thought he was coming from peace talks. First things they did to him, they took away his horses and his weapons. So the post traders, Layton, Jordan, and Hendrickson, bought him off the military. The Marquis de Morris, many in North Dakota know about the Marquis de Morris, the town of Medora, the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. The Marquis de Morris bought 200 and was right at 60 head of them horses off the post traders that were Sitting Bulls. Both Marquis de Morris and his wife were very good horsemen. I mean, they loved good horses. They loved tough horses. He bought them horses with the intention of starting to raise them on a large scale. We also know that H.C. Heidi Cooper, he ranched down by Amadon, North Dakota. They ran anywhere from 4,000 to 7,000 head of horses. He was one of the largest horse breeders in the country, probably the world maybe, but he went to the Marquis de Morris and hand-picked 62 mares, and in his records or his chronicles, whatever you want to call them, he says, they're a very interesting lot, because man still bore the scars of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. But he brought in a thoroughbred stud. They called him Bound. He was the great-grandson or the great-great-grandson of Lexington. He was a gray bald face, if I remember right. He was gray. And he crossed him with them mares. And in 1884, he sold some out east near Chicago for up to $2,200 as polo horses. What he was trying to breed with them native horses and the thoroughbred, these native horses, I would explain were more like a warm blood type, where like the thoroughbred, they're more hot blooded. But he wanted the good qualities, the hardiness, they had to survive out in them conditions. He wanted the hoof, he wanted all them qualities, but he wanted them a little hotter. And that's what they did, was they brought in thoroughbred. They also started bringing in, back in the mid-1880s, registered Percheron studs, and they crossed them with the native horses because, once again, they can survive in this environment, and they're hardy, sturdy, strong, but they were looking for a little bigger utility-type horse where they could light hitch in wagons and even use them for, working horses. So Theodore Roosevelt, who a lot of everybody should know, he wrote about wild horses in his journals also. There were wild horses here when he got here. So let's come to the Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which was fenced in the early 1950s. And prior to that park being fenced in, common policy for the local ranchers was to run their cattle and their horses on the national park ground. Nothing was fenced, and if a ranger seen them, they knew who to brand, they'd tell them, well, they just go move them around somewhere else. So it was common practice. But after the park was fenced in, they held a big roundup in 1954, and they did an impromptu rodeo, and the reason for the roundup was because the park had put out notifications that any livestock after a certain time frame in the national park become national park property. So they went out there and rounded up their cattle and their horses. Ranger Maury, who was at the roundup, stated to his knowledge none, if any, of the wild horses were caught or chased, because they're all interested in their own numbers or the herds. So also after the park was fenced in, policy became total elimination of the horses. And This resulted in numerous different attempts to eliminate the horses out there. Depending on what time of the year, they'd hire local ranchers. It was in the spring, early spring, when things are freezing and thawed. The ranchers, they'd have their saddle horses sharp shod. You know, of course, they got very good traction, and they'd go out and rope, and they usually would catch the older, weaker, younger ones. Sometimes during the summer and fall, they'd hire the ranchers, because once you knew a wild stallion's territory, he runs a big circle and stays near his territory. So they used jeeps to keep moving until they thought they had them good and tired, and they'd unload their saddle horses and then go rope what they could. They tried numerous Box Canyon roundups. Some of them were shot, flat out shot. They used airplanes. One year the park poisoned hay. It was a tough winter, and they put it out there for the horses, but the bison ate it. In the springtime, they set snares and snare some. I mean, they tried a lot of ways to eliminate these horses out there. But fortunately, in the late mid-60s, some of the local people started complaining to our legislators in Washington, D.C. I think it was Burdick, Young, and Redland, maybe, if I remember right. And they got the national park to leave them in there as a historical resource. But they still, of course, had to keep numbers down and tried ways to keep the numbers down. So what happened there then was, after a while, the park changed them from a natural resource to a historical representation, so which basically, if it looks like a horse, it's historically correct. Later on, here just a couple of years ago, they changed the horses from historical representation to livestock. Livestock are not allowed in national parks. So this means that they can do what they want with these horses. But this park, I've been dealing with them a long, long time. It amazes me. But, and I'm not sure if you're aware of what's going on out in the Theodore Roosevelt Park now. You know, we're fortunate to have chasing horses out there fighting for these horses. They're doing a great job. But anyway, the park decided, because when the Wild Horse, Wild Burro Act was passed, the Theodore Roosevelt National Park got an exemption to that law, so that basically meant whoever superintendent made choices. So back in the late 1970s, 76, 77, Superintendent Wickwire came along. And him, with the help of some of the local ranchers, decided they wanted to change the phenotype. They wanted to introduce domestic horses out there. So some of the local ranchers donated a couple quarter horse studs. They also got a stud from the Brookman Ranch in Montana. It was a Shire Cross stud. And the Brookman Ranch in Montana was known for raising bucking horses. So they put them out there, and it was his name, Les Selnow, I think it was Iowa, if I remember right, introduced the Arabian stud. Well, what happened then was these introduced domestic studs, they couldn't make an impact in that herd because they couldn't maintain any mares, and they'd become a herd stallion in a wild situation like that. Not all studs become herd stallions, and once they're herd stallions, they're constantly being challenged by, you know, bachelor studs or other studs, and so, you know, but so these introduced domestic horses couldn't make an impact. So in the early 1980s, they decided that they needed to get rid of the competition out there. So what they did was they started using helicopters and outriders to round them up and target the dominant native stallions. And even some of the lead mares says that every herd needs a lead mare because that's the most important one out there. So they started using helicopters, and the first roundup, they weren't very successful. The only thing they were really successful at was, I think they killed like 18 horses in that roundup because their roundup was hot as heck and running a long ways. But then they continued to every roundup, whether it be 3, 4, and sometimes 5 years later. And that was when my family, my brother and my family and I got involved. It was in the late 70s. But every year, or every 3, 4, 5 years, whenever, they'd go out there and get rid of the dominant native stallions so that these introduced domestic stallions could start making an impact on that herd. So,
what was the reason? Why?
Well, because they wanted these horses to look better. So because the cost of the roundups, the sale of the horses had to cover them costs because they weren't budgeted for it or whatever, They got government reasons everywhere for not doing the right thing. But, and I think, a lot of it was stupidity and there was a lot of prejudice because they knew they were Indian horses out there, and I think that was a strong factor, because anything the Indians had was no good except their land. People don't realize that our government, since the mid-1850s, started eliminating Native people's horses. They take a village, and we know they destroyed, their food, their homes, and people, dogs, and there's documented cases where the cavalry was sick to their stomach from shooting so many horses, and sometimes they forced them to cut their throats because they didn't want to waste bullets on these horses. So, long story. But anyway, the park continued. I think if I remember right, it was in 2006 is when they took the last full Nokota stud out of there. In 1991, we're going to have a roundup again out in that park, and Leo and I decided we needed to talk to the governor and the attorney general. Their offices are across the hall from each other. Leo's idea was, well, nobody's been listening, nobody's going to pay any attention. Let's bring a load of wild horses up there and turn them loose on the lawn out there. I'm going, well, it'll get you attention, but not what you want. So we decided, we had a skeleton of a Nokota, we brought it in, set it in the middle of the hallway, and asked the governor and attorney general to stop that roundup until they start to pay attention to what they're doing,
same. You can just look at me while we talk.
So, my dad is probably the most passionate person that you'll ever meet. Loyal, dedicated. I've never seen someone fail so much but succeed at the exact same time. I haven't met a lot of people that have not fallen in love with him. When we say that you're part of the Nokota family, it's because not only do they fall in love with the horses, they fall in love with my dad. And just the passion that he has surprises me every day. And at his age, the things that he does and continues to do absolutely amazes me. I go out and help him, and I'm sore and cold and tired and frustrated. So I couldn't imagine being in his position and feeling defeat so often, but continue to push on.
Where does that take? Like, there's not even words to describe what that entails for how many
He's
years?
one of a kind. About over 40 years. So as long as I've been alive.
And you were saying your dad is the Nokota horse, and the Nokota horse is dead.
Absolutely.
Can you tell
I
me
think
that
I should have
again?
maybe warned you when you say, you know, it's about you. He, in my entire time of being with Dad, it's almost like he doesn't exist. He's only here to be a champion for these horses. Nothing about him is ever first. He feeds the horses first. He uses his money to buy food for the horses, to continue to keep the farm. So when you're doing this special about someone you should know, he's never really going to talk about himself because it's never been about him. It's always been about something bigger than him. And that's what makes him happy. So.
And seeing that passion and growing up around that passion, how has that impacted you, and how has that made you who you are today?
It's molded me into a very strong but compassionate woman. We've had tons of trials and tribulations with these horses. We've had people that have come in for the wrong reasons. We've had people that have tried to take advantage of us and take advantage of the horses. We've had people stab us in the backs and even stab us right in the heart. And the things that he has taught me is that you never know anybody else's battle. You've never known what they've been through. And we've been through so many battles. We've grown up fairly poor. So what he's taught me is that kindness is the best thing that you can show to somebody. And I always think to myself, when people come in it for themselves and not for the horses, I can't mentally comprehend that. I don't know what that means to do it for yourself. And I learned that from my dad, that things that may benefit other people and they'll try to take advantage of that, we've never done anything to benefit for ourselves. And I think that is probably the best feeling that you could ever have, is just being kind and not selfish. And that's all I know, because that's how we grew up. You're thankful for even a piece of bread, even if it's one for the whole family. You have fun sharing that whole piece of bread with 10 people. You find the happiness in the tiniest little things in life.
It's a You don't see that much these days.
No.
And do you hope to try to continue this legacy?
I've been not accused, but I've been told that I only do it because I'm protecting my father. And I used to think that too, that it was just because I'm a daddy's girl. I grew up with just him. And my sisters are a lot older. So it was a lot of the times just him and me on the farm with the horses. And I used to think myself that it was because I loved my father so much and because he has molded me into such a strong woman that can think for herself. I had to go back and understand, why do I feel so passionate about these horses? We grew up with them. They're our brothers and sisters. He treats them as if they are humans. They belong on this world, and nobody else will fight for them, so he's going to. And that's what's in my heart, is that I will continue to fight for these horses. And even as much as I love my father, it's because of these horses is what's going to drive the passion. So if it takes me down the hole that my dad went through, he did it, why can't I?
Amazing. And can you, Krista, repeat to me what you said over there about who your dad is?
My dad is the horses, and the horses are my dad. It's hard to divide them as two different entities. He saved their lives, and I didn't know this until I was older, but the horses saved his life.
That's that Vietnam connection.
Yeah.
And he's so right. You think about the hippotherapy, even, my little guy has a rare genetic disorder.
Oh, no.
And he's wheelchair bound and nonverbal. So when he's saying he is the voice for these horses, I'm like, that's me. I am the voice for my son
Yeah.
who can't speak.
Oh, yeah.
And that's one. Now that he's getting stronger, it's like I want to take him to hippotherapy, because you hear so many beautiful things that happen with individuals. These connections that they have, the horses just know.
Yeah, they do. They can sense your energy.
Yeah.
They read your energy. And I think that's the beautiful part of me. Even my Uncle Leo at one time told me that you belong with these horses. And it was just the energy that the horses and I shared.
That had to meant a lot to you, coming from your uncle.
My uncle was like a second dad to me. He was there just as much as my dad. They were both champions for the horses, and I was the youngest, and I just kind of followed along on a lot of the trips that we went to out east, down south. I've taken, I couldn't even count how many trips with my dad to voice the horses and just to be there and to learn, because he won't be here forever. And if his goals of working together and getting these horses back to their people isn't done before he leaves this earth, then I feel like that's my job to continue it.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.